The first thesis is that revolutionaries must present a line of march. And this is a quote from the Communist Manifesto. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes all others forward. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the mass of the proletariat the advantage of a clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. And if you look at revolutionary movements around the world, if you look at socialism in particular, there are basically two types of people who become socialists. On the one hand, you have what you might call a revolutionary intelligentsia. And wherever you go in the world, no matter what country it is, you have this. Students, intellectuals, young people that feel like the world that they live in is just not fair, and they want to overthrow it, and they want to overturn it, right? And they tend to be a very small minority, and they tend to be from the middle class or the upper class. They tend to be younger. You know, some people do it their whole life, but it's more popular among younger people. And they essentially feel like the old order is unjust and corrupt, and they want to bring it down, and they want chaos, right? And it's a minority in society, and no matter where you go, no matter what the conditions are like, you find that grouping within society, right? That's the first grouping. But the second grouping is the broad masses of people, who for the most part are not interested in socialism until a crisis arises, right? And they want socialism for completely different reasons. They don't want socialism because they want chaos. They want socialism because they want order. It's capitalism is making their life chaos. They can't pay their bills. They're being forced to fight in wars. Their life is becoming unlivable. And they turn to socialism because they want order, not because they want chaos, right? And when society is stable and when the economy is good, they're not interested in socialism. They're only interested in it in a time of crisis, right? And that distinction between the revolutionary intelligentsia that always exists and the broad masses of people that generally ignore politics and socialism but get interested in it in a time of crisis needs to be clearly made. Because if you look at what Lenin did with the Party of a New Type, he took people from the revolutionary intelligentsia and he got them to operate in a way that they could organize the broad masses of people, right? And that's really what gave the power to the Bolsheviks. And if you look at it, you know, it says revolutionaries, I'm saying revolutionaries must present a line of march. And what is a line of march? So, you know, there's always some wise guy, if you go out and promote socialism, who says to you, what would you do if you were the president, right? And I think it is absolutely necessary for anyone who seriously believes in socialism to be able to answer that question. And to not answer that question with, oh, I don't want to be the president, I want a violent revolution. Why? Because most people don't want a violent revolution. Violent revolutions are horrific and catastrophic events in which thousands of people die, and no rational person goes around saying they want a violent revolution. And the answer can't be, oh, I would just do what some liberal would do, and then they'll say, why do I need you? I can just vote for some liberal, right? But they should always be able to answer the question. And that ultra-left adventurism that you hear from a lot of leftists, they say, oh, I want to burn it all down, I want to tear it all down. That's not proletarian, it's not working class. It satisfies a lot of people in the revolutionary intelligentsia who feel like they just want to tear it all down. But in reality, the broad masses of people have no interest in that. And actually, William Z. Foster, who's probably the greatest communist in US history, very famously said, the working class and other toiling elements are always and instinctively champions of peace and democracy. This fact is so because the toilers are the ones who always have to suffer the most from the tyranny and from war's destruction. They pick up the sword against those who oppress, exploit, or would butcher them only when they have no other alternative, and only when the road of peace is closed to them, right? A lot of people think communists are people that run around screaming that they want a violent revolution. Well, no, that's a deviation. That's ultra-left adventurism. Communists are those who say they present a line of march, right? You know, if a working class person asks a socialist or a Marxist, what would you do if you were the president, they need to be able to answer the question. Now, the second thesis is the line of march that is presented must be a line of march for the entire working class. And this is about what Nick said earlier. When there is a crisis, you generally get the ruling class whipsawing the working class. Now, what's a whipsaw? That's an old tool. It's a saw that you used to cut a log with, but it had two handles on it, on the one side. And when the one guy's pushing, the other guy's pulling. When the other guy's pulling, the other guy's pushing, right? It's a whipsaw. It goes back and forth, right? And that's generally what the ruling class does when in a crisis. They find one section of the working class, and they promise to help them out if they'll help beat down and deprive another section of the ruling class. And then you get another section of the ruling class that says, okay, I'll help you if you can help us beat down and whipsaw and degrade this other section of the ruling class. and workers basically become foot soldiers for one section of the ruling class against another section of the ruling class. And Park Chung-hee, what he did in South Korea was basically, right, they had had the April Revolution, conditions in South Korea, they were actually at that point poorer than North Korea was. And so the Kennedy and Johnson administrations worked with Park Chung-hee, and they went in there and they created a huge industrial urban middle class. They got Japan and other countries to loan South Korea huge amounts of money. They used the South Korean government to create a state-run steel industry, POSCO, and they raised the standard of living in urban areas in South Korea very high. But at the same time, they then exterminated huge numbers of communists. They drove the standard of living in the rural areas down. They actually built a concentration camp for orphan children. That's just a horrendous, horrendous story. But because the standard of living was rising for this urban working class that was the constituency of Park Chung-hee, they backed him up. So one section of the ruling class, one section of the working class was used by the ruling class to beat the shit out of another section of the working class, right? Or you can go talk about, Hitler in Germany, for example. In Germany, in the Weimar Republic, you had, factory workers, industrial workers that were paid a pretty decent wage compared to the unemployed and the masses who didn't work in factories. So Hitler came in and he built his brown shirt army of desperate, poor lumpen people, and they broke the unions of the Social Democrats and of the trade unions. They broke the unions, right? They drastically reduced the conditions for the industrial workers, and then they hired a lot of these unemployed, folks. And it's funny, there's a lot of talk about fascism nowadays, and I don't want to get too much into that discussion because there's a lot of disagreement about that. But ultimately, when you have one section of the working class being mobilized to attack and beat the shit out of another section of the working class in order to stave off a crisis, that can be a pretty accurate definition of fascism. When the ruling class effectively whipsaws the workers against each other, one section attacks another section, and in order to counter that, revolutionaries should always be presenting a line of march that is a line of march for the entire working class, telling the entire working class, we will raise you all up out of poverty. We advance a program that will be the economic rejuvenation of the entire country, to raise the standard of living of all the workers so that you don't fall into this trap of being whipsawed that ultimately leads to the crisis. So that brings me to the third thesis. Revolutionaries must go wherever people are voicing opposition to the status quo. And, in the Communist Manifesto, there's another quote. This is actually towards the end of it. He says, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social order and the political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question the property question, no matter to what degree of development it's at the time. So essentially, revolutionaries, serious revolutionaries, would break with the left-right dichotomy. For example, I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I was there, and there were loads of communists at Occupy Wall Street. They weren't particularly loved, but they were there, selling their paper, talking to people, But I look back on that, and I wonder, there are a lot of communists at Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street wasn't a communist movement. There were a lot of communists there. There were no communists at the Tea Party, right? And you ask the reason, why was that? Well, they say because the Tea Party was right-wing, and Occupy Wall Street was left-wing. But here's the thing. The Tea Party, what was it about? It was taxed enough already. Tea. Well, Bernie Sanders and a lot of people on the left would agree that the tax code is rigged against the working class. And that working class people that are mad about their taxes being rigged and about the fact that they're being ripped off by the tax system should have heard from socialists about why that is, and heard that the answer is not free markets and deregulation, right? And that there's a saying that you should lower your buckets wherever the people are, not where you want them to be, right? And there's this feeling that the left can only occupy left circles, right? That the only people that are recruitable to socialist politics are those on the far, far left fringe of the Democratic Party. And that's a recipe for disaster, because ultimately the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, is trying to figure out a way to preserve the system, whereas those who want socialism are fighting for a new social order. Right? So they should go wherever people are voicing outrage and opposition to the status quo and try to win them over to a line of march, to a socialist program. And that brings me to point number 4, is revolutionaries must oppose all forms of anti-humanism and pessimism. Right? I gave a talk about ancient Rome a couple weeks back. And I talked about how in ancient Rome you had your hedonists and your stoics. Right? And your hedonists were people who just lived for pleasure. Right? And they went to the gladiatorial shows, and they had drunken parties, and they lived for pleasure. But you had some Romans who just couldn't buy into that, and they were Stoics, right? And that meant that they took lots of drugs and had mystical experiences, they starved themselves, they followed philosophers that said there's more to life than wealth and money. But neither the hedonists nor the Stoics could offer a way out of the Roman Empire. The problem of the Roman Empire was that it was holding back history. It was beating people down all over the world, and its entire existence was in opposition to historical progress. And the only forces that could have saved Rome were the proletariat and Julius Caesar, who had a line of march. And the line of march wasn't, we're going to tear apart the Roman Empire and have a big bloody war. The line of march was changing the way the Roman Empire related to the world and having the Roman Empire begin to engage in historical progress, right? And there's a lot of pessimism in the world today. Climate change is real. I believe in climate change. It is 100% real. Look at the weather we've been having, how erratic it is. Climate change is a fact. However, the answer to climate change is scientific progress. We need more funding of scientific research to develop new methods of getting us off of fossil fuels and new energy sources. We need new development. The answer to the problem of climate change is not everyone just becoming poorer in order to preserve the environment, right? And I also want to say the same about cultural issues, right? That you cannot convince somebody who is opposed to abortion. You cannot have a rational conversation with them and convince them to change their opinion. That around these culture wars, this is not a rational discussion. You're arguing with people's fundamental religious and deep beliefs, cultural beliefs. You're not going to change that. But somebody who might not be able to agree with the left on a cultural issue or a gender issue might be able to overall agree with a line of march, with a vision for economically rejuvenating the country. And that if you want to actually change society, you need to be able to mobilize people with whom you disagree on issues. And I think that conversation needs to be had. And then the fifth point is revolutionaries must glorify strength and not weakness. I talked before about the fact that there are these two schools. You have your revolutionary intelligentsia that always exists, and then you have your broad masses of people, right? And among the revolutionary intelligentsia, a lot of them, the reason that they are attracted to revolutionary politics is because they don't like authority. They feel that those who are in power and have authority are oppressive and brutal, and they're outraged and opposed to such authority. And that makes sense. However, for a lot of those folks, I feel like that has morphed into a kind of pathological worship of anything they perceive as weak, right? You can take the Jussie Smollett case, right? Jussie Smollett, according to what's being alleged by the police, hoaxed a hate crime. He made himself the victim of a hate crime, right? And everyone hates him for it. No one's praising him for it. Now, Donald Trump has lied about all kinds of stuff, right? He's falsified a lot of things about himself. But he maintains a huge base of people who admire him. Why? He lies in order to make himself look stronger, not in order to make himself look like a victim. And there are working people in this country that are suffering, and that they want a way out of the crisis, and they don't want to follow someone who looks like a victim. They want to follow somebody who looks strong enough that they can lead them out of the crisis. And for a lot of people that are in this revolutionary intelligentsia, that are angered by authority, anything that reeks of strength is seen as a threat, is seen as oppressive, is seen as fascist. And so because of that, there's this opposition to anything developing on the left that would reek of strength. And that's a problem, because ultimately when people are suffering, they want to get behind somebody who looks strong enough that they could solve their problem. And that seems to be a big problem that exists in left circles. You know, people often ask why Students and Youth for a New America, this youth group, why they wear suits. Right? Because serious politicians wear suits, right? When working class people vote for politicians to solve their problems, they're wearing suits. You know, that you have to look at all times like you're somebody who would like to lead the country, and not someone who would like to lead the country into a violent revolution, someone who would like to lead the country out of the crisis, someone who would like to improve people's living standards and lives. And on that note, I wanted to point toward the slogan. The slogan that Students and Youth for a New America has adopted. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A government of action. Neoliberalism says the government should stay out, right? The government shouldn't do anything, hands off, laissez-faire. But socialism and the transition towards socialism in Venezuela and other countries began with a government of action coming into power. Take the opioid epidemic. A government of action would immediately declare an emergency over the opioid epidemic. It would nationalize the pharmaceutical companies and use their profits to build treatment facilities all over the country. It would provide treatment to those who suffered addiction to opioids, and it would mobilize the community to wipe out the scourge of heroin addiction. A government of action here in New York City would immediately impose a tax on landlords for having empty housing units, and as a result drive the price of rent to affordable levels. They would also restrict real estate sales in order to halt the speculation market that has been driving the price of real estate and rent higher. A government of action would declare that houses are for living in, not for bankers and landlords to make profits, and would force the market to adjust based on this understanding. A government of action would immediately renationalize the subway system and take it out of the hands of the public beneficent corporation, the MTA, that's been ripping off the public. The government of action would hire the China Railway Corporation, the state-run train company that makes the fastest trains in the entire world, to rebuild the public transportation system. A government of action would not bail out banks, it would seize them. It would put lending and the distribution of credit into the hands of the community and allow the community to determine how money should be spent, what corporations should receive a subsidy based on what they can do for the community, right? A government of action would stop allowing big corporations to rake in super profits from oil and gas and the coal, right? Instead, it would declare that the oil, the gas, the coal, and the timber of the United States, it's the property of everyone who lives in this country, and the profits from it should go to build more universities and more high-speed railway and for the overall development of the country. A government of action would stop spending billions of dollars to maintain hundreds of overseas military bases, occupying and drone striking people around the world. A government of action would utilize the money being spent on the military, and more importantly, the human beings in the military who actually want to serve the country, and would use them to rebuild the country, fix up the crumbling highways, the water systems, and the power plants. Any communist who cannot give an answer to what would you do if you were the president is in complete dereliction of duty. And I wanted to just end with the point, there's a very famous writer named Thomas Carlyle, not a Marxist, not a socialist, but he's a well-known historian, a sociologist. And in his writing, he talks about how a lot of the great prophets of ancient times, like Jeremiah and Zarathustra and Muhammad, a lot of the times they would emphasize the end to idolatry, or the worship of idols, right? And he talks about, what does this actually mean, this worship of idols, right? Because the people in ancient times, they weren't stupid. They didn't literally believe they could just carve some piece of wood or piece of stone and that would be God, right? That when these idols or fetishes were erected, when they were erected, people associated them with higher principles and higher ideals. And when these prophets came along, like Jeremiah or Muhammad or Zarathustra, came along and urged the people to stop worshiping idols, what they were saying was that they should stop being routine, right? They should stop worshiping this piece of wood and actually start believing in the principles and the passions that this piece of wood, this piece of stone once stood for. Carlyle talks about how the prophets are those who come to restore passion and meaning and truth to the earth when things have become routine and dull and unquestioned, right? Well, I feel very much like Marxism in the United States has become a land of idols. You've got a lot of forces who bow before their little picture of Rosa Luxemburg or Trotsky or their holy leader from the 20th century and go about living a routine. And I hope that everyone in this room can become a kind of 21st century prophet of Marxism, and that you can encourage people to cast away their idols and instead return to the principles and the passions and the truths that once built the socialist movement and once led to the transformation of whole societies. And on that note, I am finished.